Manuel Komnenos is one of the most heavily criticized emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire, as historians throughout the ages have attributed the disintegration of the empire just 24 years after the end of his rule to his overambitious policies. First to criticize the emperor was his almost contemporary Nikitas Choniatis, who focused more on the emperor's character to justify the misfortunes of the empire, probably in an act of state propaganda targeted against the Komnenians. A similarly biased view comes from the Western scholar Edward Gibbon, who accuses Manuel of treacherous dealings with the Seljuks in order to get rid of the Crusader armies of the Second Crusade who were ravaging through Byzantine lands. Another invalid concern on Manuel's reign comes from Paparigopoulos, who attributes the emperor's long-term failure to the leniency shown to the Latins, who in turn corrupted the empire culturally. More grounded 20th century opinions, like the ones expressed by Shalondon and Ostrogotsky, claim that Manuel's overambitious external policy was the one that overstretched the empire and eventually doomed it. Additionally, an emphasis is given to the Battle of Myriokephalon, as Kugler and most later historians explain. This battle doomed the fate of Anatolia the same way as Mantiqueir did 100 years earlier. Despite validity in some of those claims, we have already explained our views on the causes of the sudden Komnenian collapse in one of our previous videos based on Alan Harvey's work, where we explain how a system of powerful elites allowed economic expansion and strong external policy, but proved especially fragile in the absence of a strong emperor, manifesting as a classical example of elite overproduction. The goal of this video will be different though. We'll try to prove the mastermind of Manuel Komnenos and the strategic rationale in his attempt to create a great sphere of influence around Constantinople. A sphere that rivaled, and in some cases even surpassed, the one of Basil the Bulgar Slayer. Based on Daryl Keith Gentry's paper, we'll describe the grand strategy of Manuel. A strategy not shy in its own pitfalls, of course, but nevertheless a strategy that constructed a system that endured the so-called catastrophe at Myriokephalon and projected Byzantine power and interests to inconceivable lengths. To achieve this, we'll analyze the 4 different fronts of Byzantine external policy at the time: Anatolia, the Holy Land, the Danubian frontier, and Italy. If you enjoy videos like this, consider supporting Project Glorious on Patreon. As a thanks, you get access to maps and art from our videos, exclusive articles written by our researchers, early access to videos, voting on and suggesting future topics, and much more. Click the link in the description. In 1071, the most consequential battle in Byzantine history took place, Mantiqueir. After this defeat and the subsequent Roman infighting, the Turkish forces of the Seljuk Empire inundated Asia Minor. Even if this event led to the gradual loss of Anatolia, the situation had been reversed under the Komneni. With the disintegration of the Seljuk Empire shortly after its success, it fractured into independent states and much of its land was subsequently reconquered by the Romans with the help of the Crusaders. By 1143, during the ascension of Manuel, 2 main Turkish powers still occupied the peninsula: the Sultanate of Rum and the Danishmenids. A few more also lay further east. The Sultanate of Rum was the direct successor of the Seljuks in Anatolia, deriving its name from the term used by the Turks to describe the Romans, Rum. By the mid-12th century, the Sultanate had been reduced to the center of Anatolia with its capital in Iconio, and had acquired a unique Persian character for its culture and elite. Its leaders styled themselves with Persian names such as Kai Khosrow or Kaikabad, and Persian was often used in its administration, especially in large cities. The countryside of the state included pastures for the Turkmen tribes, coupled with Christian villages scattered across the land. To the northeast lay the domains of the Danishmenids, another Turkish state established by Danishman Gazi in 1086 with its center in Amasya. The Danishmenids are an important part of later Turkish folklore that deals with the problems of a nomad people trying to live a settled life in a town or a village. They were also styled as the kings of Romania, while in their coinage they used both Arabic and Greek, with occasional figures of a rider slaying a dragon-like creature. The Seljuk invasions deeply shaped the region in one more manner. Peoples from the east, like the Persians of Rome, had been relocated to Anatolia, but even more numerous were the dislocated Armenians. Their presence in Cilicia had historical precedent, as the border of the Empire of the Grand Mets reached there since antiquity. Their renewed presence was attributed to the loss of their homeland in 1045 to the Byzantines and later to the Seljuks. In Cilicia they established a new kingdom, which was suppressed by Manuel Komnenos but would rise again under the reign of Manuel Komnenos, playing a significant role in the region. Armenians also lived in other parts of Anatolia too. Manuel Komnenos' strategy in Anatolia applied the principle of divide and conquer. After campaigning up to Iconio and unsuccessfully besieging the city in the beginning of his reign in 1146, the Crusaders of the Second Crusade also attacked Rome and were defeated by Sultan Masoud. Nevertheless, with clever diplomacy, the Sultanate became a Byzantine vassal in the decades to follow, even joining the Byzantines in campaigns against the Armenians. Manuel used the Danishmenids and the Zengids as a counterbalance to Rome, who only defied Byzantine sovereignty after the collapse of the Danishmenids and the subsequent rise in Roman power. Manuel is heavily criticized for his failed attempt at containing the Turks, as he was defeated at the ambush of Myriokephalon in 1176. The defeat, however, was not as catastrophic as it is often described. The advancing Seljuks were defeated in the Meander Valley at the battles of Ielion and Limochir, essentially maintaining the power balance in Anatolia. In addition to the failure to keep the Turks subdued, Manuel eventually lost control of Cilicia to the Armenians, who managed to eventually establish a relatively prosperous kingdom. The Holy Land, or the Levante more broadly, was regarded as a rightful Byzantine possession by Constantinople, and its control was deemed crucial by the state. Thus, in times of power, the Byzantines projected their influence in the region. To achieve that, Manuel devised a foreign policy of balance between the Crusader states and the Muslim powers. In the beginning of his reign, the Crusaders faced a major shock with the fall of Edessa in 1146, an event that sparked the Second Crusade. The Crusaders sought to reinforce the remaining states of Antioch, Tripoli and Jerusalem, but unlike the First Crusade, it was mostly national armies of Germans and French that joined the endeavor, without much success. It is widely accepted that Manuel sabotaged the Crusaders. This wasn't without good reason. The Crusader armies would march by land, devastating the Roman territories on their way, and their intentions against the local populations could not be trusted. Furthermore, the Crusaders had already broken their oaths in the First Crusade when they refused to hand their conquests over to the Empire as it was agreed. Lastly, if the Crusaders managed to bolster the Outremer state's power, Byzantine influence in the region would diminish. In regard to the Muslim states, the two main powers were the declining Shia Fatimids in Egypt and the Sunni Zengids in Syria. The Fatimids originated in Tunis and were a well-known rival to the Byzantines throughout their confrontations in Sicily. By the 10th century, they have gained overlordship over Egypt and have clashed with the Macedonian emperors. However, their power by the 1150s was in decline. Manuel was concerned that their lands would come under the rule of a dangerous energetic ruler. The Zengids, like the Rumi Sultans and the Danishmenids, were Turkomans who established control over Mosul, Aleppo and Edessa. Being one of the stronger powers in the region, Manuel would pursue policies at times friendly and at times hostile towards them. One event would mark the power balance in the region during the reign of Manuel, the Battle of Harem. The defeat of the Crusaders to the hands of Nur ad-Din Zengi and the subsequent capture of the Crusader state leaders brought them into a position of weakness that the empire used to bring all the Crusader states in its sphere of influence. Nevertheless, Nur ad-Din had evolved into a substantial threat that challenged the hegemony over the region. Both him and the Byzantine Crusader alliance would fight for the control of Egypt. It is thus evident that Manuel's expedition to Demouat in 1169 was not a reckless act of overextension, but rather a strategic necessity to close up the Eastern Front once and for all. And he proved to be right. In 1171, Egypt fell to the hands of Nur ad-Din's Kurdish commander Saladin, who would go on to extinguish the Crusader plans of dominion once and for all. The Kingdom of Hungary was the emerging power in the Balkans in the 12th century. Being the result of the Magyar settlement after their invasions of Central Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Magyars, with Western help, had created a centralized Catholic and prosperous realm, one which would challenge Byzantine authority in the Balkans. Along those two centers of power, the Russian princes had placed their bids for power. The three main princes of the once united Kievan Rus were Kiev, Suzdal and Galich. The rule of proximity set the stage for the Byzantine and Hungarian spheres of influence. Galich, the principality mostly threatened by Hungary due to their shared lengthy border, fell under Byzantine vassalage, being Hypospontos to Constantinople. To counterbalance Galich, Kiev would align with the Hungarians, while the even more northern principality of Suzdal would try to counter Kiev by loosely aligning with the Romans. In contrast to the Middle Eastern and Anatolian fronts, Manuel would pursue an extremely aggressive and successful policy north of the Danube, and not without reason. The Balkans would prove the most stable of the Komnenian dynasty's regions. With Anatolia being almost lost after Manzikert, the Balkans remained the only safe space for the Romans. The pacification of Bulgaria under Basil the Bulgar Slayer and the annihilation of the Cumans and the Pechenegs allowed the Balkans to prosper like never before in Eastern Roman history, especially in the south. It was in the Komnenian period that much of mainland Greece rose in significance once again, with many churches and coinage of the period being testament to this boom. In the beginning of Manuel's reign, the Hungarians tried to challenge Manuel's rule in the Balkans. They stirred up a revolt in Serbia, they raided Byzantine northern territory, and even negotiated exchanges of territory with claimants to the Byzantine throne. Most alarmingly, they attempted to create an anti-Byzantine coalition. Germans, Serbians, Bohemians and Russian principalities would oppose the Romans. Nevertheless, all actions backfired. The King of Hungary, Geza II, died in 1162, sparking a succession crisis that the Byzantines tried to use to their advantage. After a failed attempt to pursue contenders to the throne, eventually Manuel negotiated with Stephen III, whom he helped win the Hungarian Civil War, to hand the Dalmatian coast to Constantinople and raise his son Bela as a hostage, with the goal of bringing him under Roman influence. Still, Hungary was strong diplomatically, but that was also about to change. Manuel defeated the Serbs and focused on Italy to defer German attention from Hungary, while he also shifted the Russian power balance. With Hungary isolated, he invaded Stephen in 1165 to recover the Danubian forts lost to Hungary. Stephen retaliated, and thus, with Gallic's support, Manuel invaded and devastated Transylvania. Stephen counterattacked again, with a conflict culminating to the Battle of Sirmium, Manuel's brightest hour, a defeat that sealed Hungary in Constantinople's sphere of influence, a settlement consolidated even further with the ascension of the Romanized Bela to the throne. Under the rule of Manuel, Byzantine influence reached places that had not witnessed Roman control since the days of Belisarius. However, these campaigns were not wars of luxury, at least initially, but rather necessity. The Normans, descendants of Vikings, had managed to conquer all of southern Italy and Sicily by the end of the 11th century, and since then they only projected power outwards, threatening both the Pope and the Byzantines. Manuel Komnenos had dealt effectively with them, but only after suffering several defeats. In 1147, it was time for Manuel to rise up to the challenge of his grandfather. While Manuel was distracted with the Second Crusade, Roger II of Sicily organized an expedition that captured Corfu and raided Corinth and Thebes, severely exposing Constantinople. The emperor would not leave this unpunished. He recaptured Corfu in 1149 and then prepared to bring war in Italy by allying with the Germans under Conrad III. Germany at that point, or more accurately the Holy Roman Empire, was a loose confederation of duchies, kingdoms, communes and bishoprics that were held together by the power of the German emperor. A power that fluctuated between highs and lows depending on each leader's charisma and ability to acquire the loyalty of his subordinates. However, the German policy of alliance with Byzantium would change with the ascension of Frederick Barbarossa. The energetic monarch was one of the most influential figures of medieval Europe and possibly Manuel's greatest rival. Nevertheless, the plan to invade Italy went through, with the death of Roger in 1154, when the Romans captured Apulia, including Bari, and thus seriously threatened the existence of the Norman kingdom. This, however, never materialized as the Normans pushed back the Byzantines at Brindisi. This failure, however, did not deter Manuel Komnenos from pursuing the creation of a sphere of influence in Italy by aligning with Ancona and even projecting power to Lombard cities. This pursuit was not a gamble, rather it was deeply strategic. The trade city of Ancona would serve as a military base to check Norman power further south, a counterbalance to the rising Venetian naval presence, and even as a distraction to the ambitious Frederick Barbarossa. A distraction that eventually allowed Manuel to deal with Hungary without German intervention. Aside from any criticism, it is evident that Manuel was a truly Roman emperor, projecting imperial power well outside the empire's borders. What we aim to prove here is that this was not done in vain, however. The policies in all fronts share similarities. No real direct conquests were attempted, all efforts to extend the interests of Constantinople were materialized through vassal rulers that kept the balance of power in their respective regions in check. The Seljuks of Rome, the Crusader states, Hungary and Ancona served this exact role. More dangerous enemies like the Zengids, the Normans and the Germans were kept in place with this chessboard of alliances. The system was reinforced with grand campaigns of conquest, which even if they failed, they provided the empire with immense prestige. The vassals of Manuel were witnesses of imperial power, even in a failed expedition. Any ruler at the time would be informed of the capabilities of the Roman state to organize almost simultaneous expeditions in Egypt and northern Italy, and would thus strive to keep good terms with Constantinople. In the end, Manuel achieved important successes with his policies. First and foremost, his external campaigns served as a diffusion to the growing power of the internal elites. Too many contenders for too few seats in the government led to external campaigns that provided positions for the elites. This prevented civil strife to a substantial degree. Secondly, the empire's most prized possession at the time, the Balkans, were safeguarded. Thirdly, Asia Minor was still in better shape than it had been at the time of Manuel Komnenos, despite Myriokephalon. Fourthly, the power projection in Italy had temporarily brought the empire into the offensive against its western neighbors, not allowing them to pursue attacks towards Constantinople. Lastly, the prestige accumulated by the emperor made sure that Constantinople was once again the uncontested superpower of the era. Manuel, however, doomed the empire due to his own success. His inadequate heirs could not stand up to the precedent he had set, both in the interior and the exterior, with the empire losing diplomatic and administrative grounds rapidly after his death.